This week on BSD Now, we're going to be talking shop with Josh Paetzel of FreeNAS fame, hearing about his best do's and do-nots of using ZFS in production. Also, a quick look back at 2015 and a lot of the stuff starting to be talked about for 2016. So welcome to another exciting year of BSD Now. BSD Now, episode 123, ZFS in the Trenches, recorded January 6th, 2016. Hey, I'm your host, Chris Moore.
And I'm Alan Jude.
And we're glad to have you guys with us this week on our first episode of 2016. I know I always hate it at the beginning of the new year, man, when I have to write checks, and for the first 3 weeks, I'm always putting the wrong date on them, right? So we'll have to go through that transition period. But we did make a mistake earlier when I first started recording the show. I almost said 2015. Yeah. So, yes, it's officially 2016, and it's going to be an exciting year. There's a lot of stuff happening. A lot of cool releases going to be happening across all the BSDs. And, of course, we should probably recap a little bit of some of 2015, which leads us into our first article here. But as we start the week, we got to look back at 2015 brought to us by Larry over at Phosphorus. And he mentions a few things that stood out to him from the past year. But aside from an issue he mentioned where he's having trouble with tap to click on his touchpad, he wants to turn that off. He said his PCBSD experience for 2015 has been pretty good. So Larry, first of all, if you hear this or somebody knows Larry, ping him and tell him to jump on PCBSD on Freenode.
Yeah, I actually had the same problem with my PCBSD laptop and sent him the wiki page and bit that I used on Twitter to solve that problem. Basically, you set once you switch to the Synaptic driver, which is off by default for some reason. I have no idea why.
Yeah, we should probably just turn that on, huh? Be done with it.
I'm not sure if it makes a difference on anybody else's laptop, but it makes a big difference on mine. But then it has there's a sysctl that controls how close together two taps have to be considered a click or whatever, right? And I just set it to 0, so it's impossibly short. You can't possibly do it in 0 milliseconds.
You can't do it.
And so now tap to click doesn't work, and I am much, much happier because using it to move the mouse, and sometimes if I go like that really quick, it thinks that I'm trying to click on something, and I never, ever am.
Which just causes
I think I changed another one too, so that if my palm touches it, it doesn't think I'm doing something.
Yeah,
because otherwise it would think I was clicking in the middle of a block of text as I was typing, and then it would erase an entire block of text, and then I would be very upset.
Weird stuff.
I'm writing docs.
The touchpad's position.
Yes,
right?
and as it is, if I'm working on my laptop, it's because I'm traveling or something, so I'm cramped up like this or some other
on an airplane.
Uncomfortable position, and having your the mouse pad fighting with you, the trackpad fighting with you while you're trying to work in cramped confines is not fun.
That's right. So, well, first of all, Larry, I hope you got that fixed. But if not, ping us. Let us know.
Yes.
Maybe we can get that taken care of. But interestingly enough, he mentions that this really isn't his first time running BSD. He said apparently back in the ye olden days, he got NetBSD up and running on a PowerBook G3 until an update brought that experience to an abrupt halt.
Yes.
So I don't know what happened there. I'm sure.
He was trying to do that by his source upgrade or whatever and had fun with that.
It blew up. But he gave a shout out to the FreeBSD Foundation as being a great go-to source for a wrap-up on all the previous year in FreeBSD land. And he also mentions the great 4.4 release of Dragonfly. So good job there, guys. And some of the variants that have started to pop up, like RetroBSD and LightBSD, which we'll discuss a little bit later in the show.
Yeah, more news about those.
They're making some news.
We'll have to see if we can get some interviews with people working on that.
We should.
A couple of them,
what the use
a couple of them talked on IRC about it. It's basically, it turns out that that fork of RetroBSD is a fork of, BSD 2.11 from, long before anybody ever invented FreeBSD or NetBSD. The original BSD 2.11, because that's the one that still works on a PDP 11, which apparently people have.
Well, hey, for embedded folks, you never know. Maybe.
Well, yes. The interesting thing there is that hardware with 400 kilobytes of memory, and it's okay, whatever.
I guess. But he left us a little tease for 2016 that he's been doing some work with some folks on Twitter to port over, I guess, Mopidi, I guess is how you pronounce that. But it's a Python-based extensible music server. So maybe we'll have something new lands in the ports tree here soon.
That'd be cool.
That would be exciting to see. I guess maybe like a Plex alternative is what it sounds like to me.
For
anyway.
music, yeah.
Yeah, I've not personally used it, but looks interesting. Hey, the more the merrier. Okay, so since we look back at 2015, now we got to take a quick look forward at 2016. Since the new year's starting, it's time to start maybe planning out your schedule. So we have a nice link here to the BSD events site where they have their calendar listing all the upcoming conferences and shows where BSD is going to have a presence this year. So first of all, if you see something that's messing on there, get in touch with them and tell them so they can put it on there. But there's a lot of items on the agenda, more than your usual suspects of like BSD Can and Asia BSD Con. There's a lot of other conferences out there that aren't necessarily BSD focused, but have BSD presence there, like Scale and FOSDEM.
Yeah, Scale's going to have a bunch. There will also be, from the sounds of it, a bunch of people from Jupiter Broadcasting, the network this podcast is on, will be there. I think they'll have a live Linux action show and some other stuff, but it might be interesting if you're going to be out there to look up those people and, talk with other people that are fans of the show and so on.
For those that don't know, that's Los Angeles, by the way.
I thought the dates for Scale and FOSDEM were a little closer together. Maybe not. Because when I was looking at it originally, it was like, well, I'd literally have to like leave one conference in order to get to the other one.
Yeah. Traveling straight from one to another, really.
Especially going.
It looks like they're just a week apart.
But so Scale will be there, and then FOSDEM, I will be there. I know Baptiste will be there. Benedict from the doc team, Christos Provos, at least George Neville Neal, Ed Maz, at least 10 or 15 free BSD people, plus some other BSD people. And on the Sunday of FOSDEM, there's an entire room just dedicated to BSD for the entire day.
See, that's cool. So, I mean, there's a lot of places you can go and actually get in touch with various BSD folks from different projects. It doesn't have to be one of the mainline BSD conferences. So, everything, we got Linux Fest Northwest if you're up in Washington State.
That's
Seattle,
like
Bellingham-ish area. Yeah, that's in April. Let's see, Linux Tog, OSDC. Oh, there's just all kinds of stuff. But one of the things that we wanted to mention too, OSCon in Portland, Oregon.
Yes.
I know it's another tech hotspot. So
yes,
that's a good one
in
too.
February, there will be a FreeBSD presence at FAST, the File Systems and Storage Technology Conference, which is the last week of February. And then, like you said, Asia BSD Con. And then I think I'll be in Germany for a whole week to do that string of conferences there. Which sadly means I will miss Linux Fest Northwest by the sounds of it.
Oh, interesting. I was going to try and make it out to that one this year.
So was I. And then somebody scheduled, 3 conferences in a row in Germany.
Right. Well, I see one problem here. BSD Can is the same time as South.
Yes, it is.
So I won't. So I will not be at Southeast Linux Fest this year because I plan on going to BSD Can, but we might have to send some other folks, either our brother Ken or Josh.
Yeah, and our producer, JT, will be at Self because that's his home conference, which is too bad. That means he can't come to BSD Can with us. But maybe we can get him to meet BSD when they announce that later in the year.
Yeah, that'll be in the fall-ish, probably October, November.
Yeah, it's usually after Euro, but it depends when Euro gets announced as well.
But anyway, you want to check that out. A couple things we want to remind you about these conferences. So aside from just being a cool place where you can come talk to some of the BSD developers and hang out, if you're thinking about doing a BSD certification, maybe that's one of your 2016 resolutions, you can take the test usually at these shows.
Yeah, I know FOSDEM will have
Drew
it.
Or Jim will be there.
Because Benedict will be proctoring that. Almost all these conferences, even the ones that are fairly Linuxy, as long as one of the,
as long as Drew or Jim or somebody else from the certification projects there, they have proctors, they can do it.
And with Benedict doing it in Europe now, I know that there will be even more events with coverage. So you'll be able to do that. Also, if you want to submit for Asia BSD Con, you have until this Friday to get your paper in. And then BSD Can is January 18th. January 19th to get your submissions in for BSD Can. Both of those are definitely worth going to.
Sure.
We'll be at both, right?
I will be at BSD Can and Asia for sure.
Here.
Got it. got to do those. Probably not Euro for me
Right.
this year, but Meet BSD, I'm pretty
Mm-hmm.
sure. Obviously, it's an
Mm-hmm.
IX one. And Texas Linux Fest, I think I'm going to try and make it down to that. Northwest uh, Linux Fest,
Okay.
probably. That's
Yep.
tentative. But and then sometimes Ohio Linux
Mm-hmm.
Fest, just depending on what time of year it is and if it conflicts with anything else. But some of those I can drive to,
Yes,
which is nice.
Texas might be doable for me if it doesn't land at the same time as the Cambridge thing. But I think Cambridge was at an odd time last year. Normally it wouldn't
Yeah.
conflict.
Is the Cambridge one just the Dev
Yeah,
Summit
it's
again, or
just
is it an actual
3 full
conference?
days of Dev Summit
Dev
stuff.
Summit and
Yeah.
hacking. I went to that a couple years ago. I might need to do that again.
It's usually
When did
like
they put the dates out for
uh,
that?
they don't know.
They don't. It just happens.
Yeah, it was like a month later than usual this year because of lack of organization.
Yeah, no, I don't know. Personally, I find the Dev Summit's really
Yes.
fascinating. I get a lot of stuff done
Hmm.
there, so it might be good to do that one this year. We'll
And
see.
Cambridge is a very unique experience compared to all the other places I've
Hmm.
been.
Well, that is true. That is true. So again, folks, take a look at it.
Hmm.
I know you're planning out your schedule for the next year, so see if you can make it to a couple of
Hmm.
those. Especially if there's one close to you, you kind of don't have an
Yep.
excuse. You should come out and come by the booth. Usually, IX sends a bunch of folks out to run like a free BSD booth, and then you'll have some open BSD guys, especially at the European ones, I'd imagine, who
Hmm.
show up, and you can get some swag and talk with some of the developers face to face, which is
Yeah,
always fun.
that's oftentimes a great way to get a problem solved. Is developer might be
Hmm.
aware that there's a certain bug, but they're not really aware that it affects many people. But even
Yep,
just one person talking to them in person about it over dinner or just in the hallway at the conference or whatever, and then they're like, I'm gonna fix that now.
that's right.
There's
That's
nothing
right.
more motivating. Every developer's short on time, but there's nothing more motivating than actually doing it for someone you
See,
know.
I think I'm on the annoying side of that. I tend to come to these with a laptop and be like, "See, something doesn't work. Fix it, somebody,
Yes.
please, please." A little begging, but
Hey, it
hey,
gets
get stuff
stuff
done.
done, and that's the important thing.
That's right. So, Alan, so for this next story, tell us a little about this. I guess there was an article making the rounds talking about, I guess, some of the hidden costs of using ZFS for your home NAS.
Yeah.
So,
So
tell us your take on that, being one of the resident ZFS experts.
So I'm not going to say the article's FUD or anything, but I know that a bunch of ButterFS people are trying to use it as FUD. Um,
Hmm.
but so this article recently came out and it's trying to dissuade people from using ZFS on their home NAS because of this perceived inflexibility. Specifically, if you set up your home NAS with 6 drives or whatever, when you want to add capacity to it, there are kind of limitations on the ways you can do that, and it could end
Hmm.
up with you having to have more parity drives than you would want. Uh,
Sure.
but who's ever said that's too much parity? I want to risk losing my data, right?
I know, right?
So the article points out that, well, most experienced users with ZFS already know, but a lot of newcomers are not strictly aware, only vaguely aware, maybe, that expanding a ZFS pool is not always as straightforward as you think it might be, right? If you set up with a
Hmm.
RAID Z with, 6 disks, so the capacity of
Parity.
the two of the drives is used up as parity, although it's not those
Hmm.
two specific drives that are the parity. The parity is spread out across
Sure.
all the drives. But anyway, if you want to grow that, you can't actually redo a RAID Z to make it wider to fit more disks because the data would
Hmm.
have to be redistributed and that would be very complicated. So the other option is to add a whole second RAID Z VDEV. But, ideally you want them to be about the same, they want to be the same number of disks so that they have the same IOPS and performance characteristics.
Sure.
So all of a sudden that means if you want to add space to your 6 drive ZFS pool, you have to add 6 more drives, which is,
Hmm.
can be relatively expensive, but also means, do you have that many extra
6 more
ports on your
ports and
motherboard and so
yeah.
on? So really the recommendation I have is if that's something you plan to be able to do is to just incrementally grow your storage machine, maybe mirrors are better because then you can add drives 2 at a time. Uh,
Hmm.
Although RAID Z VDEVs are not entirely inflexible, you can upgrade one in place by, if you had one that was made up of 6 1 terabyte drives a couple of years ago, you could then 1 at a time swap those out for 5 terabyte drives. And then once all the drives have been replaced,
You snowbird,
then
yeah.
all of a sudden your pool is 5 times bigger.
Hmm.
But yeah, there's a couple of different options. So, if you have 6 disks and you did 3 mirrors of 2 disks each, you'd only have, say, if they're 2 terabyte disks, you'd have 6 terabytes of usable space instead of 8 that you would get with RAID Z2. It does mean that when you want to grow it, you can just add 2 more disks at a time.
Sure.
And, as over time, say your machine, the case that you have and the ports you have on your motherboard mean that 8 drives is your limit. But when you started, you could only afford 4 6 drives. So you did that with 2 sets of mirrors. Then over time, you add 2 more drives and 2 more drives. Chances are that every time you add new drives, those new drives are actually going to be slightly bigger. And because they're mirror sets, you would actually still get that usable extra space. Because as long as the mirror, you get the space of whichever of the 2 drives is smallest. And normally you want them to be the same size. So, if you had 4 2 terabyte drives, and then when you added 2 more drives, you added 3 terabyte drives, and the next time you added 5 terabyte drives, you have all the space, and now you're out of physical room. But what you could do is one at a time replace 2 of the 2 drives in one mirror of your smallest drives. So taking out a bunch of the 1 terabyte drives and putting in 5 terabytes, and now you got that extra space, and just keep doing that. And basically, as you rotate around and around, your drives just keep getting bigger, and you get the extra space. In the end, maybe it costs a little bit more, but it gives you that more flexibility. But I think the important things that the article didn't really cover are the disadvantages to doing what they wanted to do. Right? So they're basically saying there's a ZFS tax when you expand the pool of being forced to have more parity. Right, if you do the 2 different VDEVs. But if you don't, if you had 12 drives and only RAID Z2, compared to having 2 separate RAID Zs of 6 drives each, so the same total number of drives, you're going to get twice the IOPS performance out of having the 2 separate VDEVs.
Sure.
Also, the resilver time for replacing any one drive is going to be a lot faster because you're only going to have to resilver the smaller fraction of data. And so that makes a big difference, especially, if the resilver time is already approaching a couple of days, then the chance of losing a second disk is higher. And if you're using RAID Z1, then a second disk means you're over. All your data is gone. And that's why most people would use RAID Z2 or 3 instead of that. So there's quite a bit of an advantage to using the smaller sets of disks rather than larger. So there's the IOPS time, the resilver time difference, but also just performance in general. If you did it with mirrors, it would be even faster because you get that many more separate VDEVs. And mirrors also just in general give you better read speeds because you can read all the data's on both drives, so you can read from both of them at once and get even higher speed. So if you want the flexibility, then mirrors are actually better. Even though they're maybe slightly more expensive, the ability to, only have to buy 2 drives at a time instead of 6 can actually be better.
That's a good deal. Yeah.
But the big thing is, if your other option is to use MDADM or ButterFS, you have to then weigh the risk of all your files going away.
Right.
There've been bugs in MDADM where it's lost all your data. ButterFS has lost lots of people's data. ZFS hasn't.
That's right. That's why they store things like, the Star Wars movie on it and stuff.
Exactly.
So, yeah. Important
so,
things.
Yes, there's this little bit of a cost to ZFS, although it's not hidden. It's right there in all the documentation. It's just a trade-off, whether you want to do more flexibility and more speed, or if you really need the storage efficiency. In general, you don't want to have your RAID Z stripes be wider than 8 or 9 disks, maybe 12 at the very max. Because of resilver times, but also IOPS and so on. If you have 12 disks, it's like, well, I could do it all as one big thing with like RAID Z3, or I could do it 2 smaller ones, RAID Z2, RAID Z2s, and then I lose 1 more drive to parity, but I get twice the IOPS out of it, and I have just more resiliency. And if I decide I need to expand the pool, I only have to buy 6 more disks instead of 12 more disks.
Sure.
And so on. But basically, mirrors are always the answer, except for when you can't afford them.
Okay. Well, thanks, Alan. Well, next up, we have some ongoing work that's been taking place in the FreeBSD Fabricator, which is the reviews.freebsd.org site. We have some patches that have now moved out of that into FreeBSD Current. but specifically one of the patches that's been in there for a while has been the support for boot environments in the BSD menus. So it's been in Fabricator for a while. And we've
Yeah,
had
I
it in
guess
PCBSD for like 4 or 5 months
originally
now.
posted
We've
it
been
in
doing
the
it for a while.
summer and had a little bit of work, but it had sat there basically waiting to be ready for a while. But
Yeah.
then Thomas Soom over at Illumos wanted to replace Grub in their boot process. And so he ported the FreeBSD bootloader to Illumos. And in doing so,
That's great.
I mentioned to him, hey, check out my boot environment thing. And he grabbed that and did it the Illumos way, which is actually back to having a config file instead of actually reading the pool like mine does.
Oh, really?
Because that's how their badmin tool works.
Okay.
Because that's how they did it with Grub, right? So,
Sure.
so in that, he found a couple of bugs in my code and contributed them back. And basically, with his help and with more Forth code from Devin Teskey, but Tumas also did a huge amount of Forth, including actually parsing the entire badmin config file on Illumos in Forth, which just melted my brain. You know, the approach we took in FreeBSD was specifically to avoid trying to do anything in Forth other than draw a menu.
There's some pain involved there. That's right.
Anyway, so I committed that on New Year's Eve, actually, and that should end up in FreeBSD 10.3 and 11.
When you're merging it back.
Hopefully in the next couple of days.
Okay.
Although some people pointed out there might be a bug with the way it works on serial consoles. And if you try to use the boot environment menu when you have ZFS, but don't actually have boot environment configured, it can look a little weird. So I'm going to try to add a couple things to that for it. But
cool.
The problem that it faced was it doesn't work with UEFI yet. Although currently our UEFI doesn't boot ZFS yet. But
well, kind of, sort of. There's patches floating around,
which we're about to get to. But
okay.
in some even further cross-project collaboration with Illumos, Thomas Sooms is like, well, we need UEFI on Illumos as well. And since I just ported over your nice loader with menu and everything, how would I teach your UEFI code how to draw a menu? And so there's actually... no, this is done in the C part.
Really? It's in the C part. Okay.
The Forth expects the C to be able to do serial drawing, and so it adds both. Anyway, so Tumas actually wrote the code to add terminal emulation to our EFI code. So now, committed as of 3 hours ago, FreeBSD's UEFI loader can actually draw the BSD menu. So now the ZFS boot environment stuff, I need to do like one or two little things to hook it up, but we'll be able to draw the ZFS boot menu.
So I won't have to do the trick where you can only activate it from a running system anymore. I can just pick it at the menu. Nice.
And then separately, I think it was Eric. I forget his name now. Where's my link here? Grab the link. Started the project originally to add ZFS to the EFI loader so that you could boot ZFS. But Steve Hartland has continued that work and got it working. And so his patch here is just pending a couple reviews to be able to be committed. And then we'll have our EFI loader will be able to draw a BSD menu, have the ZFS boot environment menu, and boot ZFS.
That's perfect.
So these things, actually, I don't think any of the people that were working on originally knew that the other people were working on the other bit of it, but it just happened to all come together just in time so that 10.3 should have everything.
That's going to be great.
I'm going to have to scramble a little bit to see if I can get Gelly to work in EFI.
Yeah, that would be the very last thing we need. So once we have that working, I mean, there's no other use case for Grub that I really care about.
Other than running a bunch of different operating systems, I suppose.
Dual booting a bunch of things. Sure.
And by the sounds of it, if you want to dual boot FreeBSD and Illumos, you might be able to do it with the FreeBSD loader.
Yeah, that's cool.
Anyway, so yes, separately, I have a review on Fabricator to add Gelly support to the boot code and loader for BIOS booting. So this allows you to boot from UFS or ZFS with the regular BIOS boot menu, even if they're encrypted with no unencrypted partition. You just have your regular FreeBSD type boot, and in that little, 128K bootloader, it actually has enough Gelly to be able to decrypt the partition to load the loader, which then the loader was expanded slightly to have Gelly support to be able to load the kernel, and then you can boot regularly. And it also takes advantage of the work you, Colin, and Devin did previously, so that you only have to enter the password once rather than if you had. When during my test setup, I purposely did it with a mirror, and originally you had to enter the password 6 times for the 2 disks. Once for the boot code, once for the loader, and once for the kernel, each times 2 disks. Now it's just 1 time. If you have different passwords for each disk, it will be slightly annoying, actually, but,
Well, hey, that's up to you. If you set it up that way, then you expect to type them in.
But it purposely will not run you out of your number of attempts because of that.
That's cool.
But, so hopefully all that can happen, and I will also scramble to see if I can't get the Gelly stuff done for UEFI before 10.3.
Well, we've had all these patches in our current builds for a while, so I guess we're going to be doing a 10.3 PCBSD, so I'll need to merge some of our changes. Like badmin, we made some changes, so if you're not using Grub now, it knows how to do things the right way and not need to generate a config file and all that. So I guess I'll be backporting some things as well, so we can include those all in 10.3. It should be great. Yeah, if you can get your Jelly stuff in there, I can switch my laptop, which would make me very happy.
Yes, that would be quite a good thing, I think.
Yes. And maybe we'll see more developers with their fully encrypted root ZFS laptops. Would be great.
Yes.
Okay, well, we got an exciting interview coming up here in just a moment with Josh Paetzel of FreeNAS fame, so you'll want to stick around for that. But before we mention or get to that, we want to mention right now the first sponsor this week, which is going to be DigitalOcean. Website for that, digitalocean.com, where you can go and get signed up, create an account, start rolling droplets pretty much immediately. And of course, the droplets are super cheap. I mean, they go all the way down to $5 a month, and you can get a FreeBSD loaded right up in there. It's all natively supported. And of course, you can do OpenBSD as well.
NetBSD recently.
NetBSD.
Because they actually give you an HTML5 console. So even on a device you don't need Flash or Java or anything, and you go into their control event and you can actually get to, a serial console on your virtual machine. And so you can basically trick it into running whatever OS you want. And you can also rent the virtual machines by the hour, in which case the cheapest one is 0.7 cents per hour.
Wow. Well, if you want to make that last a long time, I mean, they're giving out a $10 credit right now. So if you type in the coupon code FreeBSDNow, it'll give you a $10 credit towards your account, and you can use it for running a VM straight for a couple months. Or like Alan mentioned, if you're doing it hourly, that may last you a while. So definitely an easy way to play with some different BSDs up in the cloud. And of course, they have data centers all over the world, so you can try and pick something closer to you.
Yeah, they have San Francisco, New York, Toronto, UK, Netherlands, Germany, and Singapore.
Okay, great. So yeah, go to digitalocean.com and get signed up today. And if you talk to them, let them know that you heard about it here on BSD Now. Okay, we're joined now by Josh Paetzel. First of all, you've been on the show before, but thank you so much for coming back.
Sure thing. Nice to be on again.
So I guess your title now at IX, titles tend to change there, and who knows what it is every week. But I guess at the moment it's storage architect. So we're glad to talk to the architect today, and we got lots of stuff to talk about related to storage and ZFS.
I try not to use my Matrix voice.
Right. Well, it's too bad. If we didn't get you a few weeks ago, we could have had the Santa hat and beard back, maybe.
I dug it up out of storage. I was almost going to wear it today, and then I was like, nah.
Yeah, just a couple weeks too late. Oh, well.
Yes.
All right, so you got the next one, Alan?
So we've heard that you've moved away from the Bay Area, and you're now in a new location. How's it treating you?
It's not too bad. This is home. So my wife grew up in very northern Wisconsin up on Lake Superior. And I grew up in the Twin Cities area of Minnesota. So we're halfway in between those. We're in a pretty remote location, northern Wisconsin. But this is really our people. So we fit in pretty good here.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Well, Alan was pointing out to me, you're actually farther north than he is. I had to look at a map and go, no way, I guess he is.
Yeah, how's that?
Yeah, it's one of my favorite things to do about living here is troll the Canadians about how I'm going south to BSD Can this year and stuff. Like, no, we're in Canada. You're in the U.S. It's like, yeah,
Oh.
nah. I'm in one of those parts of the U.S. that's north of some of the parts in
Yeah, so
Canada. It's
I,
all
I
good.
live in the good part of Canada. That's further south.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
So how's the internet connectivity up there? How's that work?
Well, I have far better internet here at my house than I had living in Silicon Valley.
Oh, that's
So it turns out that the internet infrastructure here is relatively new, and there's only one way to bring internet to people who live widely scattered over large areas, and that's via fiber.
hmm
So you'll be happy to know that I have a shiny fiber connection running right to the house.
Oh, I hate
They're
you.
more than
Both of
happy to
you.
set that up as fast as you want. They're like, how much do you want to pay for it? You want a giggy fiber connection? No problem. I live quite modestly with a 10 megabit connection,
hmm
so it's pretty slow by modern standards, but it's also like $7 a month or some crazy thing like that too. So
Well, really,
twist the knot.
it's all about the reliability, right?
Yeah, so far as I know, there hasn't been an outage. So I've been living here since July,
hmm
and as far as I know, it's never been down. But
You guys are killing me, both of you with fiber under your house. That's it. I'm moving up to where you live, Josh. I mean, gosh, hook me up. All right, well, let's get into the meat of this here. So I know you've done a lot of support and stuff with ZFS over the years. So tell us what's the most interesting ZFS bug you've maybe come across so far.
well, I was thinking about that. The most interesting bug that I've ever come across is we moved from ZFS version 28 to feature flag
Mhm.
stuff
hmm
at the same time that we moved from Samba 3 to Samba 4. And Samba 4 has native support for ACLs,
hmm
and Samba 3 sort of faked it and used Unix permissions behind the scenes. And it turned out that if you did not upgrade your Z pool and use the feature flag 5000 kernel modules with Samba 4.1 with a pool created on version 28, you could corrupt your pool.
Really?
And yep, blow away the space map and end up with kernel panics when you tried to import the pool read write.
hmm
And so we, you had to import the pool read only and copy the data off, and then scrag it and rebuild it, because of course there's no tools for dealing with a ZFS pool with a bad space map.
Mm.
So that's probably the most interesting bug. Um,
How long did it take you guys to figure that out?
yeah, a little while.
Right?
And the best part about that bug is send and receive snapshot replication would happily send the corruption over to the remote system as well.
Ooh.
So we actually lost some primary pools and some backup pools to that, where the primary pool would go corrupted, and then, the backup pool is corrupted as well.
Oh,
Yeah, that was a little less than pleasant. So
But
man.
that's probably the most interesting one.
but the pool wouldn't import,
uh,
but the data was still there.
Yeah, you could import it read only,
Right.
because then you don't care about the space
Mhm.
map. And so that's what we ended up doing. In fact, it ended up we ended up doing a Memorial Day recovery run down to LA, where I loaded my truck up with pallets of 4 terabyte hard drives and shelves, and ended up driving them down from Silicon Valley to LA, and over the long weekend recovered a system that had that
Mhm.
problem. So
Oh, man. I guess you don't have to do too many of those up in Wisconsin now.
no, but there's a joke about never underestimate the bandwidth of a station wagon filled with magnetic tape, and never underestimate the storage capacity of a full-size SUV filled with 4 terabyte hard
Mhm.
drives either. So
Oh, man.
Yeah, I think Google still does that experiment every once in a while and finds that it's faster to ship hard drives FedEx than it is to try to use the internet, no matter how fast your internet is.
yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, we had about 300 terabytes in the back of the truck, so
Nice.
Tracy was pretty happy with that.
Oh, I bet.
Although now I can fit that in like 8 U's.
Yeah.
So how difficult is it to actually support ZFS in production? Especially compared to other file systems.
Yeah, so there's a few things that are frustratingly game over situations with ZFS that you wish weren't.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, if you add VDEVs that you're not particularly happy about adding, you can paint yourself into a corner there. Now there's talk about there being detachable VDEVs someday.
There's code for that actually works, but it doesn't work with RAID Z, only with mirrors and stripes. But that does
Okay,
solve the
yeah.
problem of when you're trying to add a slog or something and you accidentally add it
Yeah.
as a single disk stripe.
Yeah,
So that's
yeah, that's unfortunate.
that is or will be undoable, but not in a way that it will still leave it there as a reminder. So any data that got written to it will be remapped to a different drive, but it will stay there as a virtual VDEV that just can't store anything
Right.
to taunt you about your mistake forever.
Mocking
Yep.
me silently for years to
But
come.
yeah, I almost feel like
Side you go, forever will dominate your destiny,
That's
right?
right.
it almost seems like
Anyways, so that's
yeah,
frustrating. That can be somewhat frustrating, and that's caused some problems in the past. It makes it frustrating to deal with because a lot of times in a production environment, backing up all the data, destroying the pool, and recreating the pool is not a particularly attractive
because
option.
it'll take like a
And
week.
so, yeah, there can be that. Even in some environments where you have the additional storage to do it, simply migrating the data, you can do sends and receives on the back end, but eventually you have to flip the switch, and so that means taking services down. And when
Mm-hmm.
the service is, iSCSI and 300 VMs, it is just a lot of times not a convenient time to do
Mm-hmm.
that, you know.
Sure.
So that can make things challenging. Um, Another thing that can make things challenging is the aforementioned ZFS space map. Corruption in there, problems in there. There's no check disk, there's no FSIC, there's no anything. I mean, space map corruption is game over.
Mm-hmm.
You can import the pool read only, you can copy the data off, and that's certainly a much better scenario for a lot of people than the alternatives. However, it would still be nice to be able to repair those pools. Um, and it's just not an option, having the option, right?
Is that just that?
You might argue that a 400 terabyte pool might take 3 weeks to do that too. But at least having the option to do it is better than having no alternative at
Yeah,
all.
because
Is there a
So
technical reason why that doesn't exist, or is just nobody's written the tool to do it yet?
I think it's nobody's written the tool simply because it doesn't scale very well, and so
Hmm.
you very quickly run into these it takes 3 weeks,
well,
kind of a thing to do. So and people going, well, nobody would want to do that.
in ZDB there's
And they're
right
probably
in
correct,
ZDB there's
but
one that can scan the space map and try to find lost space, but not actually fix it.
but not fix it. Yeah, yeah. So what you'd want to do is rebuild your space map from the blocks that are in use on the pool. Scan the whole pool for blocks that are in use and use those to build a new space map. And that tool doesn't exist.
And would have the extra complication of more space will probably be allocated in the meantime.
Right,
Right.
exactly. Right. You'd need space for that space map, right? And you certainly wouldn't be able to write to the pool while you were doing it. So some other things that make ZFS a little challenging. Um, People always knew that long RAID Z groups would take a long time to resilver, and that they would take a long time to scrub, especially as they filled up. But I think it took, some of these pools were large enough that it took a couple years to get enough data on them to really reap the full measure of the consequences of that decision. And so, people were deploying these pools with 30 10 drive RAID Z2 VDEVs. This is awesome and this is great. And look, I have 400 terabytes of storage and they're amazingly resilient. And then they get to be 70 or 80% full and they have a drive fail. And oh my goodness, it took 3 weeks to resilver the drive, or it took 2 weeks to resilver, or it took 9 days to resilver or something. So some of those things are starting to come to light. And those were not immediately obvious properties of ZFS.
Mm-hmm.
So the other thing that isn't immediately obvious is those resilver times are totally dependent on file size as well. So, if you have a pool with 4 billion 4K files on it, resilvering a drive in there is a lot different than having 100 1 terabyte files. And that wasn't immediately obvious either. So, I think some of those things are starting to come to light. And that does get a bit frustrating because, in those very large pools, if you have a single degraded drive in a VDEV, you have additional redundancy. However, it's not the sort of thing that you want a 3-year-old array cranking away at maximum I/O for 9 days. It just doesn't make anybody feel good.
Right.
And the consequence is, 400 terabytes might just go away here if this goes sideways. So that makes things a little challenging. Certainly the benefits of the RAID Z resilver when the array is empty is really cool. You can do a drive replacement in seconds on an empty array, minutes on a lightly used array, but as they get full, the tables quickly turn to favor the hardware RAID controllers.
Yeah, so I know specifically because of that, in the case of mirrors, there's actually talk of an optional sequential resilver instead of actually walking the metadata and doing the smart resilver, because once it's more than about half full, it actually takes longer to do it the smart way. But again, I don't know that that's possible with RAID Z because you don't actually know where the blocks start and end without crawling through the data.
Right.
And then, but yeah, it seems like maybe the ZFS add command should require to use like the force flag if you want to add a single striped VDEV to a pool that has any VDEVs that aren't all stripes, just to maybe prevent some of that foot shooting.
Yep. Yeah. The ZFS add command definitely warns if redundancy levels are different these days. So there is some warning for that, and it has that -n flag so that you can always see what you're doing. So
it
so
just
that
requires
helps.
people
Of course,
to know to do that, and no one remembers until they've shot their own foot off once.
And the other problem with FreeBSD is your tendency is to want to use virtualized device names, and so to avoid device name hopping around and making you sad. And so a lot of times when you're adding devices to pools, you're dealing with GPT IDs or some other type of label, and so you might not even immediately realize that you skipped a line reading glabel list, and that's not really the hard drive, that's an SSD, or it isn't always immediately obvious that you're doing something that you don't want to do. So I get very, very paranoid when I'm running zpool add. I use the N flag about 3 times, and am I sure I want to do this? Am I absolutely sure? Am I really, really sure? And of course, FreeNAS and TrueNAS, we've wrapped all that stuff in a GUI, and it's ostensibly user doable, and you always kind of like, hey, we're going to be expanding our pool this weekend. It's like, can we help with that, please? Because that is something you really don't. Well, it's going to be Saturday night. It's like, yeah, I would much rather hop on a call with you on Saturday night than
have you do this wrong?
Deal with the ramifications of sideways.
Yeah. The desperate Sunday morning. Oh my gosh, what did I do?
Yeah. So it makes me, expanding storage, it's always sort of a miracle to me when you expand storage and it doesn't, it's always my nightmare, that you go to expand storage and all of a sudden everything vanishes.
Sure.
And you're like, what just happened here? Fortunately, I've never seen that happen with ZFS, and I'm fairly confident, but, when you're dealing with large amounts of data, it's, use 500, 700 terabyte, 1 petabyte pools, and it's just, it'd really be inconvenient if they went away.
Yeah. So we have a backup, but it would take a month to restore.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of that stuff is nobody would be very happy about that. So.
So over the last couple of years, we've been talking a lot, of course, about IX, who's a sponsor here, but they've built some pretty darn wild systems that we've shown pictures of and kind of make all the watchers and listeners drool over. So do you have a favorite out of any of the crazy stuff that got built down there?
We've got some pretty big systems. Some of them bigger than others. That there is some 8 8 shelf units out there with 4
Hmm.
terabyte drives in them. And those would be the old shelves, so they're 45 drives per shelf.
Oh wow.
Um, a lot of those units were not necessarily optimized for size, but were optimized for spindles for running VMware.
Hmm.
So they aren't even as large as they could be because mostly they're running VMs and things like that aren't necessarily space intensive but are IOPS intensive. Um, our standard hardware platform is a dual E5 2600 of some sort,
Hmm.
and going up to 512 gigs of RAM. So I think some of the stuff, when you start to think about a dual E5 system with 512 gigs of RAM as being mundane, then you know you're broken by hardware, right?
Right.
So yeah, I mean we have some stuff in the labs that is a lot more fun than that. And at one point we built a system with a ridiculous number of disks, and we had 4 terabyte drives in it, and it ended up being shy of a petabyte of storage, so we called it the Terafiler,
Hmm.
and that was pretty cool. And then we upgraded the drives to 6 terabytes, and we shied away from the obvious name change, and people marketing, I guess, thought that wouldn't go over well. So, um, and then on the systems that aren't as big but yet still impressive, we have some all SSD
Mm.
rigs running
Hmm.
ZFS, and ZFS isn't necessarily optimized for SSDs. Its write path is pretty expensive,
Hmm.
and so the performance of ZFS, in an all-out performance war, is never going to match things that do less work. If you look at XFS or ext4 or anything like that, they just don't do as much work writing, and they're always going to have a performance advantage. But there still are people who want the benefits of ZFS and the performance of SSDs behind it.
Hmm.
And so we have several all SSD rigs that we've built. They have 20 or 30 SSDs in them, and they can get fairly crushing performance as well, even though in terms of size, they're not typically very large. You're saying, well, this is 10 terabytes or 12 terabytes. Price wise, it's interesting. I was just talking to Warner Losh yesterday about the fact that the Fusion IO Octal cost more than my first house. And that was a big, all flash storage subsystem in its day. And nowadays, we routinely build things that are twice as fast as an octal. And while they certainly, aren't cheap, they sometimes aren't as expensive as my car. So,
Hmm.
Hmm.
That's
Dang.
I
Yeah.
think you're saying every couple of years we add a zero to the performance and take a zero off the price.
yeah, isn't that the truth?
All right.
Yeah.
So most of the problems that you see are probably user created, or are more of them the fault of the OS or the management tools or ZFS itself?
You know, I see um, I see all sorts of problems. Certainly having a copy on write file system available to users is a new paradigm for a lot of people. And
Hmm.
so ZFS put, enterprise storage in the hands of people who had never had to deal with enterprise storage. And so you certainly see a lot of problems caused, by the fact that, hey, you have snapshots in existence, which means you really can't delete things. And people just, that's a paradigm that people don't
Hmm.
understand. So a lot of full pools, a lot of, hey, I just deleted 4 terabytes and nothing
And,
happened,
and I ended up with less space than I had before because of the
yeah,
free
Yeah.
right.
list.
Yeah. So you see a lot of that. You see also a lot of non-intuitive problems that were caused by ZFS itself, and certainly ZFS has, taken a lot of those problems to heart and improved itself, or the developers have improved ZFS. So, for instance, before ZFS had asynchronous delete,
Oh yeah,
um, a common
Hmm.
paradigm was, well, I put 3 billion files on my NFS server, and now I deleted the data set and everything went out to lunch,
for a
you know?
Yep.
week.
So the system went unresponsive, so I then decided to reboot it. And now it's just stuck, well, with all the lights blinking and it's not fully booted up, you know? And you had to wait for the delete to happen before it would import the pool,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
And so we did a lot of, finding the TXG group before the delete and rolling back the pool to that, and then saying, yeah, you probably can't ever delete that. So having things like asynchronous delete, really improved the world for ZFS. So I would say that they've been addressing the problems. Adding VDEVs that are the wrong redundancy level. That certainly is a ZFS problem as far as I'm concerned. That ZFS causes.
That one I think is
So
sometimes even
and
just
then
confusion between the difference of ZFS add and ZFS attach sound similar, and they do very different things.
yes, yes, that can happen, or just forgetting to add the word
Yep.
log.
Mm-hmm.
Doing zpool add and you forget to type log, and all of a sudden you have another VDEV.
Yeah. I saw someone
Whoops.
that happened to someone this
Yeah.
week, and I'm like, well, yeah, and they're like, but we were planning to add another mirror to our set. I'm like, okay, so what you do is add the other drive to that, and
Yeah.
then swap out the SSD and then now you have the new mirror, and then you can add the log properly. So
Right.
you maybe
Yeah.
just saved
It's
yourself
very
from shooting
nerve-wracking.
yourself in the foot.
Yeah, so I mean, I think like most things, users are the source of most of the problems, but ZFS certainly, ZFS has been around for a decade now.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's been around. If you talk to the ZFS developers, of course, it's been around longer
It's
than
been
that.
open
But
source for a
it's been
decade.
around in the hands of people for a decade, and it's still a young, immature file system. I don't think we found all of the bugs in ZFS that might not necessarily be a bug. Hey, it's behaving as designed. It takes 3 weeks to resilver, but it's sort of, yeah, that's not really very enterprise
Mhm.
usable.
Mm-hmm.
I think we probably haven't found all those edge cases, but as we found some, I would say async delete was a
Yes.
huge one. That caused a lot of very real problems not having that.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly since that's hit, it's solved a lot of problems. Bookmark support was another big one that sort of shored up a glaring hole in ZFS. When you're using snapshots for replication, if you accidentally, if your retention time is shorter than the time it takes you to replicate them, you can have all sorts of problems.
And have to start
You're
over.
deleting snapshots that you actually need,
Mm-hmm.
and bookmarks sort of solve that problem, by letting you delete things that haven't been replicated yet and still be able to not break your replication.
Yeah, that one
So
bit us with the PCBSD package CDN system. As if one machine got too far behind and missed the window of when enough snapshots existed, basically had to start replication from scratch and resend 500 gigabytes over the internet.
yeah, that can be very
Mhm.
No
challenging.
fun.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, so one thing that happened a few months back, we read the article on IX Systems site where you did the blog post talking about being careful using ZFS in a VM, and there was some big scary language in there. And we had a whole bunch of comments and emails, and we still occasionally get those, Alan, where people are like, "What is that? What did that mean?" So, can you elaborate a little bit exactly on what that blog was talking about and what to do or not to do, I guess, when running ZFS in a VM?
Sure, sure. So
What?
the first thing to point out is VMware is the single most popular platform for running FreeNAS there is.
Hmm.
FreeNAS systems phone home and tell us what they're running on, and VMware is the most popular standalone platform um, by like heads and shoulders. So lots of people virtualize FreeNAS, and of course FreeNAS is ZFS under the hood.
Hmm.
So that's the only file system they're running. So the thing about virtualizing ZFS is you're abstracting the disks away from ZFS, which means it's no different than running it against a SAN LUN or running it against a RAID controller. ZFS no longer has direct control of the hardware.
Hmm.
And so you just need to ensure that the things that are being done to those devices is not something that ZFS will get upset about. So for instance, if you're virtualizing ZFS and the backend LUNs have a RAID controller, you need to turn the write cache off on the RAID controller. You need to make sure that any scrubs that are being done by the RAID controller itself are not overlapping with scrubs being done by ZFS. So you have to take some additional steps, and the consequences of not taking those additional steps are they can stomp on each other and cause pool corruption.
Hmm.
So, and I've seen pool corruption in the form of the pool won't import anymore, or it'll corrupt the space map, and you can't import read write anymore. So we've always recommended that, virtualizing ZFS is okay, as is running it on a RAID controller, as is running it on a SAN. Lots of people do that. For instance, Delphix, that's what they
Yeah.
do. There's ZFS on top of a SAN, right? It's clearly safe to do. However, it involves making sure that you've turned off the write cache on the RAID controller for those LUNs, or that you've disabled the parity check jobs on the RAID controller, or that you make sure they're scheduled at a different time than the ZFS scrubs. And so if you do those things, then virtualizing ZFS is perfectly safe. Running a system that has ZFS in a VM, pretty safe. In fact, we do it all the time. The vast majority of FreeNAS and TrueNAS development is done in VMs. We don't store data there, long term. But for instance, the IX Systems mail server is a VM and it's running ZFS, so it can be done safely. You just have to be a little careful about it. So.
There's some extra precautions to take, things to plan out ahead of time before you just nilly-willy deploy it and find out the hard way, right?
And I'd much rather scare people with, you shouldn't do this, it's a bad idea to do this, don't do this, and have them find out some more information about it and say, okay, I'm doing this safely, than to say, yeah, it'll be fine, when there's some, every RAID controller made has the write cache enabled by
Right, because
default,
that's what makes it
which
fast.
is, yeah, which is, a bad deal when you're sticking ZFS on a VM underneath it.
Right, so yeah, you don't want somebody that doesn't understand all the facets of it to be like, oh, I'm going to run, this on top of in a VM on top of a RAID controller because Josh said it was okay. It's like, no,
Right.
Josh said don't do it unless you're very sure you know what you're doing and you've ticked all these boxes and made sure you've actually got it set up correctly.
Exactly. So.
So to get a more experienced field ops perspective, what do you think about ZFS with versus without ECC memory? And is it any more dangerous than running something other than ZFS?
Well, the answer, as always, is it's
Right.
complicated. And this is a very touchy political situation because some people who have a lot of experience and knowledge about ZFS have weighed in one way or the other. I'm pretty sure Matt Ahrens has said there's no need for ZFS to have ECC.
His quote was more, you always want ECC, but if you can't have it, you're still better off with ZFS than using ext4.
Yeah, there we go. All right, so let's talk about that for a second. So if you have ECC RAM and something goes haywire, your system will either stop or ECC will fix the problem. Right? If you don't have ECC RAM, your system will happily go lucky scribbling on disks, whatever it tells it to do. The problem comes in with ZFS is, once again, there's no way to fix things like broken space maps. And so if you have non-ECC RAM and it's been happily scribbling on your pool and it happens to scribble on your space map, that's a game over thing. So your pool is gone. If you have non-ECC RAM and ext4, XFS, or anything like that, and it scribbles on your storage device, you run fsic and it repairs the storage. Sure, you might have some files that are scragged, because fsic isn't going to make corrupted files go away. But at the end of the day, it will happily move that stuff into lost and found, and you'll be able to mount up your file system. So, in theory, while the advantages of ZFS are nice to have, it is a bit dangerous to run non-ECC RAM and have hardware failures with ZFS, simply because there are a lot of scenarios in ZFS that are game over. So we don't ever build anything that's non-ECC. And I have to admit that I have very limited experience running non-ECC RAM on ZFS. So I had some systems at home for several years that had non-ECC RAM, and other than that, it's just not something we choose to
don't want to chance it.
deal with. Yeah, and quite frankly, anytime you're dealing with a system with a large amount of RAM, ECC becomes necessary just from other
Right. Well,
reasons. You know,
most motherboards won't support
yeah,
more than 32 gigs of RAM without ECC anyway.
right, right. So
Hmm.
so I always recommend to people that they run
Mhm.
ECC, and there's plenty of consumer stuff out there now that has the ability to run
Yes, like
ECC.
the little atom
So,
boards and.
yep, yep.
But yeah, I think
Okay.
in the end, other than obviously the space map is kind of a Achilles heel of ZFS still. Uh, but if something happens to the contents of a file, ZFS is more likely to be able to actually tell that that happened and give you an error rather than the corrupted data. Whereas if you corrupt just a file, FSCK on ext4 isn't going to find that.
No,
And
no.
so
I mean, bit
yeah,
rot is a
yeah.
real problem on, especially as disks get larger.
Hmm.
Hmm.
So, you can easily, for, under $1,000 these days, be sitting on 24 or 30 terabytes of storage. And anytime you fill that up, the chances of bit flips and files being corrupted, and, I mean, that's significant. If you run a pool that's 40 terabytes and don't scrub it for a year and run scrub, I can guarantee your chances are good that you're going to find corrupted files that ZFS will either fix or flag as I can't fix this, depending on your
Hmm.
redundancy level. So having ECC RAM, you know, is a safeguard against hardware
Hmm.
failure. Either the system will stop or it will fix the problem. Um, but it all depends once again on how important your
Hmm.
data is. I have data at home. I could care less if I lost it. You know,
Hmm.
I mean, if I really need to, I can recreate it. I have other data that is
Hmm.
irreplaceable. So the data I have that's irreplaceable, it goes to two systems at home, it goes to a backup system, and it goes
Yeah.
up to the cloud.
Hmm.
You know, and certainly my systems at home have ECC RAM, but it wouldn't be a huge loss if I lost the pool on one of them.
Right, but in the end,
Sure.
the whole reason you're using ZFS is to protect you against hardware failures on the disks. So why wouldn't you also protect yourself from hardware failures in the RAM?
Right.
Hmm.
What about
Cool.
SSDs? Especially you were talking about all SSD pools because SSDs are doing a bunch of was it like flash redirection layer or whatever, and there's moving blocks all over the place without telling you. Do you ever see unusual amounts of errors from SSDs?
I haven't. But SSDs have their own unique challenges with ZFS. For instance, when ZFS grew trim support, it was trying to trim 128K blocks, and that exposed problems in a lot of SSDs. So, for instance, you'd run into situations where you'd run zpool create, and the system would just go out to lunch for hours.
Hmm.
While the SSD was trying to digest this. Hey, it wants me to trim all of me,
But in
before it
small
creates this
chunks, not all at
pool.
once.
Yeah, yeah, that was a problem. We've had issues. I've had issues with SSDs that the firmware simply locks up.
Hmm.
I've seen SSDs that you have trim on, and over a couple of weeks the firmware finally just hangs the whole SSD. I've seen particular models of that. And so, for instance, we've had to blacklist doing trim on certain SSDs or simply not
Hmm.
use them for ZFS. So they definitely pose some challenges. Another challenge that SSDs provide that isn't really related to ZFS per se is they can handle much higher Q depths than spinning disks, and ZFS is tuned to not blow spinning disks up. So you can if you have an all SSD pool, you can turn the Q depth up and get far higher performance
Hmm.
out of them than you would with the default ZFS tuning. However, ZFS doesn't allow that tuning per pool.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
so if you have a system that has an SSD pool and a spinning disk pool, you can be challenged to find a tuning that doesn't tank your spinning disk pool or your SSD pool, because of course the things the SSD pool wants will bring bring the spinning disk spool to its knees.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, if you tune for the spinning disk spool, you're really crippling the performance of the SSD pool.
Yeah, I think the default
So
like write queue depth limit is 10, and
10.
if you
Yeah.
set it much higher on a spinning disk, then it could take whole seconds to get a read request answered
Yes.
Oh,
because
man.
it gets at the back of this long line of things that have to happen.
Yeah. You know, I mean, a 7200 RPM disk has an average latency of 7 milliseconds, which means it can do, somewhere around 100 to 150 IOPS per, and if you set the queue depth to 32, you will
Feel
definitely,
that.
definitely reap what you sow there.
Right. A little suffering
Whereas,
involved.
a modestly expensive SSD can do 1,000 times that.
Right. Yeah.
So if you could offer, just pick, say, one single best piece of advice for a sysadmin who's getting ready to deploy ZFS somewhere out in the field, what would it be?
That's a
Right.
challenging one. I would say be familiar with the attributes of a copy on write file system.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've got experience with Waffle or with EMCs or something like that, transfer that experience and that knowledge to ZFS. If you don't have experience with a copy on write file system of any sort, do some reading, because there are just attributes of copy on write file systems that aren't intuitive. And since ZFS is so different from log file systems or from journal-based file systems that we're all familiar with, you can run into some really non-intuitive behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So
Okay.
So if you could see any one feature of ZFS be implemented, what would it be?
Oh, that's easy. So I would really like to see whole pool replication between two pools. Block level, real time, whole pool replication.
So like continuous replication?
So,
Yeah.
yes. Not
Right.
snapshot based, not async at all, but just you send this TXG group to this pool, you send it to that pool. The ability to keep two pools in sync on an IO by IO or TXG by TXG basis. So,
And
That's kind of cool. Is anybody working on that as far as you know?
I know somebody that would like to do it if they could convince their employer to pay them to do it.
yeah. I've done some precursory exploration, and I've always, I think it'd be a really cool feature to have, and certainly there are business cases for it. And working for a storage-based ZFS company, tried to poke and prod in the appropriate direction. As far as I know, nobody is actually actively working on this project at all. However, it has been discussed to some degree, and some how would we implement this types of things have been kicked around. What technologies could this apply to? Is there anything that's relevant? That sort of investigation has been done. So I somehow feel that perhaps that could see the light of day. Would I work on it myself? I always like to joke that I'm the most dangerous type of C programmer. The most dangerous type of C programmer is the one that can get their programs to compile. And that's right. So the ability to, the barrier to entry to programming C is pretty high, because if you can't even get the thing to compile, then at least you're safe. I'm unfortunately slightly more skilled than that. However, I'm not much more skilled than that. So I always joke that when I'm committing C code to anything, which I do from time to time, you look out.
Right.
So probably it's not something I would work on myself in terms of writing the C code, but definitely developing the feature and helping to test it and coming up with use cases, and okay, that's not quite right. I would love to be involved with. So we'll see.
Well, there you go. If anybody's working on this or interested, you need to get in touch with Josh.
Yes, I
That'd be a
will
really cool feature.
make a connection between two people for that.
Cool. So you have any interesting war story? I guess the most difficult recovery, or anything you could think of that would be interesting to the audience here.
There's been a lot of things that I've done over the past several years. I think a lot of the really interesting problems were the culmination of a long period of research. For instance, when ZFS first debuted, it had very unpredictable write times, write latencies, and that made it challenging to use for block storage. And having that come together such that ZFS was an effective block storage, low latency type of deal or predictable latency, there was a lot of time involved in that, and a lot of things had to happen. A lot of work was done. Um, and that certainly didn't happen overnight. That was the culmination of a year's worth of effort. We've also done some pool recoveries where the aforementioned load a bunch of drives in the truck and take them down to LA. But I think a lot of the current problems are really just how ZFS interacts with things like Samba, things like NFS, and those they're not very interesting war stories. It's I went into the lab with a bunch of NFS servers and came out with, here's how we need to do this, here's how we need to do that, tuning wise to get to a satisfying performance profile. So one of the challenging things with running ZFS on big NFS servers is, big, high, busy NFS servers on 10 gig E require quite a bit of memory for NFS and for just the kernel for doing 10 gig networking. And ZFS, of course, is always memory hungry. And so finding the right balance between enough memory to not hobble your 10 gig performance versus not taking so much memory away from ZFS that you hobble its performance, and finding the right balance has been fairly satisfying, and hopefully we'll get some better auto tuning so that it doesn't require a maestro to turn all the dials and find the right thing. But some of those scenarios have been fairly satisfying.
But free RAM is wasted RAM, but any contention will just kill all your performance.
Yeah, and of course, ZFS contention for RAM typically means kernel panic, right? So, if the ARC can't get an allocation it thinks that it deserves, it deadlocks the system, or live locks, or kernel panics, or all sorts of bad, nasty, horrible behaviors. So, you tend to want to be very conservative, and then you start to say, okay, I've got a system with 128 gigs of RAM. I'm being really conservative with the ARC, and I've set it to 70 gigs. Now I can turn up NFS memory arbitrarily high as I want, because certainly networking and NFS aren't going to need 30 gigs of RAM. And so then you turn it all up, and then you go, okay, we found the optimal value here. Now we need to increase your ARC size. Well, we'll have to reboot the system. Well, we'll find a window for that in March, because you can't dynamically increase ARC. Or you go the other way and you say, well, we don't want to have to reboot the system, so we're going to just set the ARC to 116 gigs. And then you're constantly in fear. Okay, is this the NFS memory change I make that tips the system over and causes it to deadlock? So some of that stuff is a little bit challenging, finding the optimal values. And of course, networking memory requirements, NFS memory requirements, those are all so workload dependent that you can't come across any sort of useful defaults. We have customers that we've had to turn the file handle allocation off, right? Because otherwise, 30,000 people try and open 80,000 files, and suddenly NFS wants 900 gigs of memory. And so we've just had to disable it, in order to provide them with a usable system. So it's all across the board. Other people, their idea of an NFS server is two systems are going to access this, and they want to run wide open, read or write performance. So you just can't come up with usable, global defaults that work for everyone. It does require some
well, yeah, I can see, a university where every student's home directory is on this NFS server versus a thing where, we have 2 or 3 virtualization machines that are just going to read giant VM images off your NFS, right?
Right.
Do you think it would be possible to someday have the ARC limit be runtime tunable?
Yeah, in fact, I've talked about that quite a bit, and I think we understand how that would work. It would essentially be setting a high water mark instead of, you can't forcibly evict
Mm-hmm.
memory out of Arc, but you could lower the high water such that as things fell off the Arc, it wouldn't allocate new things. So
Hmm.
you could do that fairly easily. And then increasing it, of course, would be pretty straightforward as well.
Oh,
So,
that'd be
so
a neat
hopefully
thing.
that will see the light of day someday too.
Yeah, the one I was having
Nice.
this morning actually, and yesterday morning, was the daily find that goes through the system and tries to find the set UID binaries or whatever. Ever since I
Yeah.
upgraded to the latest head 3 days ago, now it makes the other allocation in Arc go up to about 6 gigs out of my 16 gigs. So my Arc
Yeah.
limit is set to 6 gigs out of 16, and so it's got 6 gigs of MFU and MRU, but then also 6 gigs of other, and then
Yeah.
there's no RAM left for anything else.
Right.
And
Right.
it was I don't know what made it start doing this just the other day.
Yeah, and of course the ZFS answer to that is, well, serves you right for trying to
Right.
run it on a system with 16
Yeah.
gigs of RAM, right? Isn't that crazy that we think that that's a low amount of RAM?
Yeah, I
these days?
remember when
Yeah.
512 was a lot.
Oh,
Now 512
yeah,
with an extra 000 on the end is kind of a lot.
yeah.
Yep.
Oh well.
So what keeps you motivated to work on open source stuff like this?
I think, I was thinking about that a little bit. I've been involved with FreeBSD since the mid '90s, um, and that was really more of a pragmatic thing than anything else. When I started my involvement, my employer was trying to convert to open source, and so it was just easier to be involved in the community than it was to constantly try to have to maintain local patch sets and all of that fun stuff.
Mhm.
I think it's just sort of um, a couple of things. One, the reality is working on commercial code bases, they're all sort of ugly. And the more closed source and secretive they are, the uglier they are, because as when you're writing code, you're trying to solve the immediate problem. You're always under a time crunch. There's always resource constraints, and you can do some fairly hideous things.
And no
And
one
just
will ever
go,
see it.
well, I hope nobody ever sees this, because if they do, they will hate the person that wrote it and think they're an idiot, but they're not under my constraints. So here's the most horrible hack I've ever written, you know.
Mhm.
But you can't open source those kinds of things, because there's always people who are going to look at that and go, dude,
What?
really?
Yeah.
Like, come on. And so open source really to me becomes sort of, you sludge through the day, and you're kind of sludging through a mud pit, and it's all dirty and hacky, and you're kind of going along. And certainly we try and do things the right way, but a lot of times there's other concerns other than the purity of engineering, right? But
Mhm.
when you get home and take the cover off of that beautiful thing, that pristine, beauteous thing, you can kind of, hey, I'm going to do this right or not do it at all.
Mhm.
And a lot of what's going on in open source is people who are doing it right or not doing it at all. And sometimes you have companies committing code, and then you have a bunch of people going, what horribleness have you inflicted upon us? Allow us to make that more beautiful for you. But I just find it
Hmm.
refreshing. It's just in a world of sludge and awful hacks and things, open source is oftentimes a much higher quality code base than what you'll run into otherwise, and so it's nice to work on that. I also try as much as possible to provide value to people. Like, somehow I feel like if I've lived my life and it didn't benefit anybody, then what was the point?
Mhm.
And so I like to think that somehow I made the world a slightly better place. And if it was using open source to build a system that did research into genetic diseases, then the world was a slightly better place. And so that motivates me as well to keep working on this. And I think why do I use FreeBSD? Why ZFS? I don't really have a good answer for that other than it was just circumstance. When I said to a friend of mine a long time ago, I'd like to learn Unix, he handed me a FreeBSD CD.
Mm-hmm.
When I was in college and the chem lab was full of Sun OS machines, it's more circumstance anything as to why I use BSD. But eventually, you just get to a point where it's like, well, yeah, this could be any project. Like I could contribute to Postgres or Linux or whatever, but I don't, and that's not what I've been doing. And so, there's a certain level of ownership that would just make it very challenging to just go, oh, the pencil is red, the pencil is blue. I switched it out for a different project, and it didn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
So I think some of those things keep me motivated.
Okay. Well, you have any other hobbies outside of open source when you're not doing computer stuff?
I like to wrench on cars, but of course, some of the physical challenges I've faced with has put a little bit of a cramp in that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I still enjoy things that go fast or make loud noises. So guns and fast cars and open source software and computers. Like I've often dreamed that I'm going to open like this giant warehouse, and I stole this name from a Steve Jackson game a long time ago. But guys, guns, guts, and gears, and just do computers and guns and an auto speed shop and just have it all be under one roof. Like I think that would just be awesome. Like be like the Gander Mountain of technology geeks.
There you go.
Anyways. But yeah, so I like those kinds of things. And of course, living out in the woods here in Wisconsin allows us to do outdoorsy stuff, and do all that fun stuff. And I definitely enjoy that. So
Oh, cool.
Cool.
Okay. Well, I look forward to seeing that shop open up someday. I have to
Yeah.
visit that.
someday.
Well, was there anything else you wanted to mention before we let you go?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Well, thank you
Yes.
so much for spending time with us today, Josh.
We
We
do.
really appreciate that. Okay, we're back. Hope you guys enjoyed the interview with Josh Paetzel. That was a lot of fun. We always enjoy having him on the show. So thanks again, Josh, for taking the time to do that with us today. So before we get into the news roundup, though, coincidentally, Josh works at IX, and hey, we got to mention them because they're the next sponsor of the show this week. So ixsystems.com/BSDNow, where you can talk to the guys over there, and it's people like Josh Paetzel who you just saw on the show.
Exactly.
And these guys definitely know what they're talking about. So that gives me a certain measure of comfort when I need to order something. Like these guys have been there, done that, and probably built far wilder stuff
Well,
than,
yes,
than you're probably going to need off the shelf.
When I built my first really big ZFS server with like 30 plus hard drives in it, I was like, so I could lay out the RAIDs this way, this way, this way, or this way. I'm not sure which one's the best. And in the middle of our conversation with the salespeople, I get an email with Josh explaining what the advantages and disadvantages are and what he thinks I should do. But, when I might consider doing it this other way for X reason or Y reason or whatever. And kind of just gave me the information I needed to make that decision.
Yeah, just having that kind of expertise under the roof there at IX, I mean, really makes all the difference because you can call, you can get an answer, and they can, go as technical as you need or just give you, hey, here's our recommendation. You're doing this. This is just going to work better for you. And just having that expertise is great. But of course, couple that with their white glove service where they can, build everything small to the FreeNAS Mini up to these powerhouse, what do you say, 8U system?
Well, it was 8 separate sleds, which I think are 2 or 4 U's each one full of 45 disks.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you want to build a storage server that takes up an entire rack.
Yeah, they can work that out for you. Anyway, again, guys, get in touch with them today. Go to ixsystems.com/BSDNow and get your new system prep for 2016. If you do order something interesting or a little unique or different, just email us.
Yes.
We'd love to hear how the experience went, and pictures are appreciated too.
Yes,
So we like to
pictures are
send that
nice.
on the show occasionally. Okay. So next up, we have in the news roundup here. I know we've talked a little bit the last couple of weeks about retro BSD and light BSD. Well, they're still making some more news here. So you want to fill us in what the first one is here, Al?
Yeah.
Looks like retro BSD.
Yeah, so retro BSD, I got a bit of background on it after the show the other week, is basically a continuing version of the old 2BSD, which I think is up to 2.11 now. And it's specifically for running on PDP-11 type systems. And so in this case, they have some new hardware called an ESP32, which gives you a dual core system but each of the cores is only 160 megahertz. It has a
Okay.
whopping 400 kilobytes of RAM, and apparently fast Wi-Fi up to 140 megabits a second.
Dual cores with 400K memory just doesn't sound right to me.
Yeah,
That's
it's
just,
like
it's so foreign.
yeah, and then it has Bluetooth Low Energy and some other low power options, hardware enhanced AES and SSL, and lots of different peripherals you can attach, like SPI, SDIO, I2S, I2C, etc.
That is pretty crazy. I guess for the people who think the Raspberry Pi is too cushy.
Yeah.
Like, that is crazy.
Well, I think the big thing is it probably uses even less power. So if you're going to build something battery operated, it probably will
That's the way to
run
go.
a lot longer than what you can on.
Did they have any use cases listed? What people are using?
I'm
this
not
for?
entirely
Is
sure
this-
what people are using it for.
Huh. Interesting. All right. Well, how about the next one with light BSD? They're a little bit more up to speed. We're all the way up to 4.4 BSD
Yes,
now.
and this is they got it running on the PIC32, which I think is the machine that we covered RetroBSD running on previously.
That's the one with a
Yes.
512K of memory. And what they say here, I guess you wrote down crypto offload support.
Yes, which is yeah. So this one has 512K of RAM and runs 200 megahertz, MIPS32 M class core machine. But yeah, with having the crypto engine and a bunch of other stuff, it's like you don't really think of a crypto offload on a machine with 512 kilobytes of SRAM.
Yeah.
But yeah, so RetroBSD is a 16-bit port of the old 2.11 BSD, whereas LightBSD is a port of 4.4 BSD. And they got it running here. And apparently you get about 200K of user space memory in the basic build.
Interesting.
That's
Well,
fun times.
yeah. Well, interestingly enough, we had another thing come in this week where an article was written discussing this. And over at thevarguy.com, we have a link here talking about how BSD Unix has been resurrected for the embedded Internet of Things market, which is interesting. But they specifically mention RetroBSD and LightBSD by name. But the point he makes at the end of the article is that this is an exciting development for embedded VARs who at least now have an alternative, different licensed open source OS they could potentially use. So,
Well, yeah,
of course,
especially,
something under a BSD license.
if you're building something there, you need it to be low power because you're going to build it into, a battery operated toy or something like that. You need something, maybe smaller than what you can squeeze out of a Raspberry Pi, or even, something like the Omega here, even if it's only this big. You need something that's not going to, require a constant 5-volt draw from, a bunch of batteries to be able to keep running. And, maybe it's not
But you still get an operating
Yeah,
system or a basic operating system.
exactly. You just need to do some basic thing. You're not actually necessarily going to be running an application on it. You just need it to basically be a microcontroller with open source software that you can actually work with.
Okay. Definitely interesting. Of course, we will bring you more information about these as it seems like they're popping up a little bit more
Yeah.
now. So that's interesting to see. Okay, well, next up we have a hardened BSD. We had a link here up on their website. Looks like Sean Webb has posted something on their site here talking about their new hardened BSD update system. So not to be confused, this doesn't look like it has anything to do with the package NG doing base system updates. This is a completely new thing they're doing. But looks pretty straightforward. Reminds me more of FreeBSD update. But it starts off with creating base.txt and kernel.txt and then a separate file for etc update. So it looks like they're using etc update there. But a couple nice things about it. It includes the option to have the kernel name in the update. So you could potentially, or they could be rolling a bunch of different kernels and you could get binary updates for all of them. You can kind of pick and choose at whim. Of course, being hardened BSD, they're very concerned about security. So everything is cryptographically signed and verified using OpenSSL from the base system. And the build system they've put together for this sounds pretty darn simple. It just uses shell, git, and OpenSSL to create the binary updates. So I do like that. That sounds really simplistic. So that's good.
Yeah.
Hey, and maybe Sean will have to take a look at that for PCBSD, stealing that from you if you don't mind. If we don't end up using package NG updating, if that doesn't end up happening
Yeah.
in
I
the
had an
near future.
interesting discussion with Peter Wem the other night about an idea I had for kind of a stopgap measure to give us a binary update mechanism until we get it. And I'm going to have to look at Sean's because it sounds actually kind of similar. And then Peter talked a bit about what the FreeBSD cluster admin team uses to update their machines. because they did one build and deploy it to a bunch of the machines in such a way that they can step forward and backward through revisions if it turns out, oh, we just updated all the machines to this revision and it turns out it has a bug that makes everything crash. Let's go back a couple of revisions.
Yep.
But yeah.
Well, Sean just said I should steal away, so there you go. Consider done. I may have to take a look at this in the next couple of weeks and see if that's something we can do for maybe 10.3, maybe 11.0. I'm not sure yet, just depending on what my timetable's like. But I saw also you guys mentioned planned features here, include updating of jails and doing ZFS boot environments, making that natively supported. So again, all good stuff. Definitely interesting. I will have to take a look at that. And if you're interested in it, take a look at the link there. There's a lot more detail than we just covered here, but that's good. We definitely need more updating systems.
Yes.
Now, I assume Sean's watching, so I assume it doesn't need to do the trick where it changes the time of the system while it's building the updates,
I think,
the FreeBSD update trick.
Imagine, I've not actually looked at the tool, but by the name and so on, it looks like it probably doesn't do Delta updates. It just updates all the files.
Okay, hey, that works.
Yeah, because the tarball of all of the base system is under 100 megs, and I think or under 200, one of the two. And anyway, the base and kernel put together are only 200 or 300 megabytes. And while that seems like kind of a lot, in the end, if you're only updating every so often, if for following something like stable or head, where you want to update a lot of things, it makes sense. Now, for a security update, having to download 300 megabytes to change one file, to update bind or something, may seem a bit excessive. But that's something that's already covered by FreeBSD update, so it wasn't on my list of things. But I can definitely see for hardened BSD wanting to avoid the complexity that is FreeBSD update.
That's right. Yeah, he says here no time tricks and no deltas, so it's just pretty darn straightforward. So again, interesting stuff. I'll have to take.
I will be looking at that closer as well.
Okay. Well, let me know what you find if you get to it before I do. I got a lot of other stuff on the plate still too.
I got to get this other stuff done for 10.3.
I know. Get the jelly stuff done. I need the boot support for that. I need it for EFI though too, because my laptop's UEFI only.
Really? I didn't think they actually made UEFI only.
Well, it's not only. It does both, but I boot it in UEFI only so that I can do the SCFP driver.
Yes, the better frame buffer. Yep.
Yeah, because sometimes you do want to run in the native resolution of the panel, and especially when it's a 3K panel.
Yes.
Anyway, okay. Well, next up here we have an article about sometimes processors need some love too. So we have a blog post from Brian Everly talking about his long journey into legacy processors and his plans for the future to start working on better supporting them, specifically looking at OpenBSD ports. And he begins his story of his Unix journey from then to today, and why this has kind of fostered his love for some of these old and not necessarily so old architectures, but things such as SPARC 64, PowerPC 32, i386, etc. But at the end of the journey, he talks about he ended up purchasing some legacy hardware, which in this case, eBay is indeed your friend. And he ended up creating a database that is listing all the major port blockers on each platform. So in other words, something won't compile on SPARC 64 and it blocks 800 other ports or something. So building the priority list of things that need to be fixed, and his journey into trying to get some of these things fixed for people running on these legacy platforms. But of course, this is the great kind of thing, if you're looking for something to do in 2016, this is a great way to get involved and help a project. I mean, probably not even a lot of actual development work at this point. He's just testing at this point, seeing what works and what doesn't, and what builds and doesn't, what's broken, so they can identify where things need to be corrected. So again, keep up the good work, Brian. That's awesome, and I'm sure the OpenBSD project will appreciate you doing that. I think he said in the article, Theo specifically asked him to take a look at some of these. So,
and I think it's definitely an interesting area for someone who's new and doesn't feel they really have some of the skills maybe they think they need to get started. A lot of times with this stuff is just doing the testing of a bunch of different applications on this particular platform is just time consuming. And it's just a matter of identifying what doesn't work and some useful error messages so that someone can look at it. It's a great way to get started. But at the same time, there are a lot of stuff that's really not that hard to do. I was writing my paper for Asia BSDCon about doing the Geli support in the bootloader, and it's like, this turned out to not be that hard. Why didn't someone do it?
Right, it just needed to be done.
Because everybody was afraid it was going to be too hard. It's like, well, sometimes if you just sit down and start whacking at it, you'll realize that, hey, this isn't actually that bad after all.
Well, you say that, Alan. You make it look so easy.
But I'm serious. I've been doing C for like less than a year. I have no clue what I'm doing. I just started adding printfs until I understood what was happening.
That is true. That is true. And that's one of the nice things about having an open source OS with all the tools and compilers built in. It's like, let me make a change and run that right now.
The big advantage is just maybe having a bit of time. That's the advantage of being younger and having you don't have much experience, but you do have time, and that's all it takes to get experience is some time.
That's right. That's right. So again, let this be an encouragement to the rest of you guys. Anybody else out there who's looking for an excuse or an avenue to get involved with one of the BSDs, this is definitely something you can do, which will be helpful. Okay, we're back, folks, and we got a whole bunch of feedback and questions, and we got some beastie bits to get to, some interesting stories there. But before we do, we're going to mention our last sponsor really quick here, which is going to be Tarsnap. And of course, the URL for that is tarsnap.com/BSDNow, where you can go and get signed up right now. I know this is the first show of 2016, so if you made that resolution around the holidays that, hey, I need to start backing up all my data offsite, well, just while you're listening, stop what you're doing. If you need to pause the show, that's fine. Come back. We'll still be here. You can resume later. But go get your Tarsnap set up right now.
Yeah.
Get it done and just check that resolution off your list. You can probably get the backups done and all set up in probably 5 to 10 minutes. Get your client configured and everything, and you're good to go. And that is done.
It's pretty easy. You just install the Tarsnap client from your package repo or from source, and the command line looks a lot like tar. You just say, hey, Tarsnap, that directory, and that directory would cause me to cry if they stopped existing, so make sure they exist somewhere else. And, they contain some stuff that I wouldn't want anyone to see, even Colin. And so they're backed up. They're encrypted first and then backed up, and that way no one has the key but you, so be very careful with that key.
That's right.
It's handily available in a printable format that you can go and stick in your fireproof safe or a safe deposit box or whatever you want to do.
Yeah, we
really don't want to lose
printed it and even laminated
you go.
it.
Exactly.
So it's so the paper doesn't accidentally deteriorate and you can't read a character or something. But definitely a good thing to do. So again, guys, set it up today, tarsnap.com/BSDNow. Get signed up, and you'll be shocked how little it costs. But hey, just the peace of mind at night, being able to sleep and know that everything's backed up is a good thing. Okay, so Beastie Bits. So we have a little bit of a funny one to start off with here. So Michael W. Lucas, who we've had on the show before, of course, author, has written a post up on his site here talking about the disclaimer he has to put on his books. And he says disclaimers are often the most useful part of the tech books, so he said he's preserving this one. So without further ado, here's what he wrote. So first draft, not for public distribution, for technical review only, not fact-checked, probably completely checked out. Some information herein not only incorrect, but actively malicious. No idea which is which. Chemically unstable, non-organic, contains nasty, leachy plastics. Beware of drop bears, game gators, and sea weasels. Bridge out, one way, no return. Manuscript is morally bankrupt and engaged in karmic panhandling. So he said, please send any corrections to the author, include page numbers, and enough surrounding context so he knows what you're talking about. Lucas is already confused. Please don't make it any worse. That is quite a disclaimer.
Yes. So this is for the new FreeBSD Mastery Specialty File Systems book, which talks about all the weird file systems and so on that you might not use every day, but could be quite handy. And so that book isn't out yet, but you can go and buy the draft version at a 10% discount off the regular price. So that I think ebooks are normally $9.99, and so you get 10% off that. So it's like $8.99. And when the book actually does come out, your copy will be updated to give you the final version when it comes out. But if you go and buy the book now, not only do you get the draft to start reading and mocking Michael W. Lucas, you also get a 10% discount.
Nice. So definitely go do that. Sounds like another good book. Okay, well, next up in the bits here, we have just a heads up that the January images for PCBSD 11 current are now available, and we'll have the link in the show notes here where you can grab that ISO or USB images. Just a couple quick notes about this month's version. First up, the system updater did go through a round of changes, so we're asking people to check that out, specifically broken into the two stages. So when you prepare to do an update, everything is first fetched, of course, and placed on the disk. All the bits are there. At that point, you are prompted to reboot, and you can reboot now or 10 hours later or whenever you feel like it, whenever it's convenient. But at that point, when you reboot, now it'll actually do the update as a part of the shutdown process after everything has stopped and the disk is in a consistent state, and then the boot environment is created at that point as well. So this was done to kind of fix a long-standing bug slash
Just
I guess,
gotcha.
flaw in
really?
how, yeah, kind of a gotcha with the way boot environments work. But before, since we did everything in the background, it was possible where you would do an update and keep working, say, for 10 hours before you reboot. Well, if you made a change to your current boot environment, say in /etc, you added a user and then rebooted, well, the boot environment that was created at the time of the update doesn't have that change. So there's no good way to try and track everything you did to the system after the update was prepped. So by splitting it up, that fixes that problem. So the download, of course, is all done in the background and can be done, while you're working, no big deal. So it will take a little longer at shutdown now while it's actually applying the update and doing the moving the bits around to get you updated. But we figure that's a good trade-off because you don't have to worry about being in kind of a weird, inconsistent state the next time you boot up. So that does need some testing. And you do get a nice little screen too. So when you get to the shutdown screen, your console blanks and it shows hey, we're doing an update now. Please wait to reboot. But if you hit Control at F2, you can actually view the full gory messages and see what it's doing if you're curious. So I needed that for my OCD because I like to know what it's doing at all times. So that's good. Also, a bug booting USB media from UEFI was addressed, so those images should be bootable again. So take a look at that. And of course, this is still built on the Haswell branch that's being worked on for FreeBSD. So if you have a Haswell video card or something, or even an older Intel, please try that out. And of course, look at the link in the announcement here where you can report bugs back to the Xorg folks if you're having any problems with that. Okay, so what do we got next here?
We have news from Package Source. They've released the 2015 Q3 and Q4 package things, and they have some statistics from them as well.
Okay. Yeah, I got a whole bunch of stuff here. Number of packages they have built. So it looks like about 16,000 on NetBSD current, AMD 64, 14,000 on FreeBSD AMD 64. That's using Clang. 14,000 plus on SmartOS using GCC. 13,000-ish Linux, 12,000 OpenBSD, 12,000 OS X, about 11,000 packages for Dragonfly, and 10,000 for BitRig. Okay. That's definitely a lot of stuff they're building there.
172 awesome. New packages. One got renamed, and 58 old ones got removed, although 7 of those had a successor of some kind.
Okay. Very nice. Very nice. Okay, here. So that was for Package Source, the quarter 4. So next, so speaking of NetBSD, this is actually a good segue in. They held their first reproducible builds conference in Athens. It was a couple weeks back, so we're just getting to it now. But this is interesting. It sounds like they met with about 40 other developers. We have a blog post here from Thomas Klausner talking about their meeting in Athens. They said there were people from various projects, mostly Debian, but they also had some Arch Linux, FreeBSD, GUIX, Homebrew, MacPorts, Tor, and some others who attended a 3-day conference about reproducible builds.
Yeah, so I guess for people that don't know what a reproducible build is, the general idea is, when you download the pre-built version of FreeBSD from the FTP site, you should also be able to download the source code, build it yourself, and come up with exactly the same binary. So it's basically removing things like timestamps, the name of the machine it was built on, the name of the user that built it, things like that from the built files, so that you end up with, if you build it now and build it a week from now, you end up with exactly the same result. And that basically that allows you to prove that the files you get from FreeBSD are actually what was built from the source code. It also makes things like Delta updates for packages and base systems so on much easier.
Definitely, for sure. Well, it sounds like they're talking about how to do this in NetBSD, making the base system build reproducible. Of course, they said a big part of that work's already been done, but there's a number of open issues. Making a package source reproducible as well. They said that's going to be a huge task, of course, because there's just so many different platforms they run on. But they said they have a very good framework, so that should help.
Yeah. The interesting. So the Debian people actually have a reproducible.debian.net where they have a build farm where they try building things, and they do FreeBSD and NetBSD now, and I think maybe some others. But they have a bunch of different things they can try. So they try, different host name, a different domain name, setting, environment stuff, building with different time zone, building with different languages, like building, with British English versus, Swiss French, and seeing if it results in different binaries, building with different path environment variables, building with a different user or group name, different, kernel versions, different UMask, all these different things, building on an Opteron AMD processor versus an Intel processor to see if that actually results in different binaries at all, and a bunch of stuff like that. And so it's nice to see the Debian project actually collaborating with NetBSD and FreeBSD and so on to solve these problems and make better stuff for everyone.
Yeah, this would be neat. I would love to see the day when that just works. That would be really cool. Okay, so last little bit of sad news here, but we have an article over at the Register that mentions here that the designer of the IBM ThinkPad has passed away. I guess Richard Sapper also worked for Alessi and Fiat as well, but he was 83 years old, a German industrial engineer who pretty much orchestrated the look of the iconic laptop, which a lot of BSD developers, you go to a conference, you'll see a lot of ThinkPads. So we did want to mention that here. So, we thank him for his work that he did on the ThinkPad, and I know it's definitely going to be a site that you'll be seeing at a lot of conferences going forward. I don't see that changing.
Yeah, and especially now that Lenovo has announced they're working on the ThinkPad Retro or whatever, that'll bring back the older style keyboard that developers preferred to the newer one.
Nice.
So we might see, some of this older design coming back. I don't think we need the floppy drive back.
No, they can leave the floppy drive. That's okay. You don't need that. I don't even need the CD drive in mine.
Just,
really. Keep it light.
I prefer you
but the keyboard
keep
cool.
the Ethernet port for sure. Don't go all Macish on us.
Well, so the new Carbon, I have that dongle, right, for the Ethernet, which is a little, but it is pretty much thin enough. I don't think they could do it any other way.
Right. I don't need my laptop that thin.
Right. Well, I like it's light. It's so light. Hey, when I'm walking up the hill in Japan at Asia BSDCon this year and I don't have that 12-pound brick in my backpack, it'll be nice.
Yeah. I'm going to have to decide how many laptops to bring. When I did Cambridge, I carried 3 laptops around. The T530 with the extra battery, so, my beast of a laptop, and 2 X220s.
Yeah, so you just basically got to bring a hand truck this year and just kind of wheel everything around,
well,
right?
That's what the backpack Michael Dexter has. Have you seen that one where it's like wheeled luggage, but then you can open it up and it has shoulder straps and turns into a backpack?
I need to get one of those. That sounds like a really good idea. But now that I got the lighter laptop, it's not
right. But just in general for traveling, right?
Yeah,
it's something you can wheel, but also use as a backpack. Because in Tokyo, wheeling is fine until you get to the stairs for the subway. Then you're like, transform into a backpack.
All right.
Yeah.
I like that. I'll have to look for that. We have some time before Tokyo, so I'll pick one of those up.
All right, moving on.
Okay, so next up we got feedback and questions. So first up we have Andrew who writes in. He asks about high contrast. He said, hey, I started listening to BSD Now a few weeks ago, and I'm listening to many of the back issues. I enjoy the show, and it inspired me to switch to BSD from Linux. I'm a graduate student with low vision. I'm planning on switching from Linux to PCBSD sometime in the next few days, but I have a few questions, though. He said, first, I'm looking for some graphics program that'll make the screen high contrast. Not just a high contrast theme for the desktop, but one that'll make every window opened easier to see. I use Windows for most of my work because I have a program that works on Windows that does this. Is there some high contrast application in BSD, or am I stuck with Windows forever? First of all, I'm not. Do you know of any off the top of your head?
Really, no. I know there's some theme type things, but not a program that will change everything.
I'm just Googling here. I assume there's probably some open source programs out there which will do that. And if you know the name of one of them on Linux, for example, I would just check FreshPorts and see if we have an equivalent analog, something that's been ported over. And if so, you should just be able to package at it and do the exact same config you would do on Linux and end up with a high contrast desktop. But I don't know of any specific app off the top of my head which does that. Maybe somebody in the audience does, in which case we would appreciate you sending that in. We'll pass it along for them. But he says, secondly, I'm looking at doing some graphics programming, and I wonder if there's a way to get Wayland on PCBSD. He said, I noticed it's on FreeBSD. Can I just download the packages from there? He said, finally, I want to use a permissive license when I program. Is there a way in BSD to avoid the GPL? Yeah, you just don't license anything
Yeah,
under
or
the
don't
GPL.
use
I
anything that is
guess.
already licensed out of the GPL.
Yeah, don't suck anything in that does. As far as WLAN goes, it's FreeBSD, so anything you could load on FreeBSD, you could do on PCBSD. I don't really see that being an
Yeah, I
issue.
think the Wayland port on
So
FreeBSD is still very experimental, so it's hard to say.
yeah, it is very early stuff. So you're gonna have to do a little bit of messing around to make that work. But yeah, you should be able to follow the same set of instructions. And I imagine there's some different sources that you have to install to make that go.
So yeah,
But
in,
give it a
in
whirl.
general, PCBSD is just FreeBSD with some sane defaults
Mhm.
stacked on top of it.
That's right. That's right. So yeah, just make a boot environment before you roll your new system and kernel and try and reboot, so you have something.
If
to
it
go
doesn't
back
work,
to
you just go back.
if it's a little sideways. That's right. Okay. Well, next up we have a FreeNAS follow up here from John. He said, "Hey, I sent you guys an email a few weeks ago on TechSnap. I guess he
Yes.
sent that to you, Alan, about a server build I was doing, asking for a bit of help on deciding whether or not FreeNAS was a good choice for my server. I was having trouble deciding if it would make a good media server or if I should go ahead and use a Linux distro to run the media component. After your feedback, I ended up deciding to go ahead and running everything on FreeNAS, and glad I did. I ended up writing a little post on my blog about how the process went in my build in case you guys were interested. We have the link here if you want to take a look." He said, "I considered writing back into TechSnap, but I figured this was a more BSD related topic, so contacting you guys made more sense. I wanted to let you know that I ended up finishing my server, setting it all up, and been using it a few months completely hassle-free, and it's been great.
Yeah.
Thanks for the advice, and keep making great shows."
FreeNAS has turned into quite the little media server powerhouse.
That's right. A lot of people are using it for Plex, I've heard, is one of their big ones. Okay, you want to read the next one here, Alan?
So Giorgio is asking about custom installs. He says, it'd be super brief. Is there a way to create a custom installer for FreeBSD? For example, I'd like to install some additional packages and or enable some services so that should I'd be able to reinstall everything from scratch. I can skip some manual steps before passing the job on to Ansible. So yeah, there's a couple of different ways. You can actually just set up a script to run at the end of the install. Basically, BSD install is mostly just a shell script. It uses a couple of little programs, but it's mostly a shell script. So if you look at I think it's user.sbin/bsd install/scripts/auto, that's the one that actually fires up by default when you run the installer. And at the end of that, you can just add extra instructions. There's also, I think, an unmount one is the part that happens near the end. So you can do it that way. Or you can just write your own installer from scratch. Basically, all you have to do is partition the drives the way you want, extract the tarballs onto those created file system, whether that's UFS or ZFS or whatever, and then do whatever you want on it. Ideally, someday BSD install will then regrow the ability to install packages by default, but I don't know that it really makes that big of a difference. For building images like VMs and stuff, Colin Percival's written a tool called First Boot. That the first time the machine starts up, it can execute a script. And so you can actually teach it to say, well, the first time this VM is booted up, install, this program in Ansible and this other program and fire off Ansible so it will kick up and do all the work. And then you can basically freeze that. And then when you deploy that 6 months from now, the versions of the packages installs will be the latest ones from the package repo. Plus, it can be set up, it'll run FreeBSD update first before it even goes and does anything, so that it'll update the OS to the latest version and then install the latest of all the packages. And then you don't have to keep re-rolling your images every time versions of the stuff change. Okay. And secondly, he says, I'd like to replace my DSL modem and router with a BSD-based solution. The routing part should be no problem, but I'm not sure about the modem stuff, so I thought I'd ask. I always liked it when the modem was separate from the router because you replace the router with your BSD thing and the modem can just be the modem. Although nowadays they're often not so much. I was lucky with the one that I had. You could basically call up the ISP and ask them to provision it in like bridge mode or pass-through mode. Don't tell them you want to run BSD or something. Tell them you have an expensive Cisco router, and then they will set it up that way. And then you can just let the router do all the work. I don't know much about hardware support for DSL modems. I don't know even that somebody makes that many DSL modems as a PCI card anymore, kind of thing.
Yeah, what would you plug in? I mean, that's probably something pretty special. Okay.
And that's about it for that one.
Okay, well, next up, we have Don, who's asking about ZFS speed. He says, hello, Alan, Chris, and JT. Awesome show. I've been listening since number 1. Well, we thank you, Don. Appreciate that. He said, I'm hoping you can point me in the correct direction. I'm seeing some serious system performance issues when doing any serious file system I.O., like find or iSync or rsync. He gives his details here. It's ASUS ZenBook. He's running he's running the January image from PCBSD already. Okay, that's cool. So this is really current. He said he also sees the issue on 10.1 or 10.2 of PCBSD or plain FreeBSD. It doesn't matter if I use the default selections or the installer or tweak it. He said the system sees 2 separate drives, 88.0's 500 gig and then 88.1's 24 gig SSD. If I do a find of my maildir or an rsync of another host, then the system gets very laggy and will appear to freeze ever so often. I'm not sure to look and see why this happens or how to fix it. So he gives us some zpool info here. Looks like
yeah,
ZFS
I think the
list.
most useful bit of information to have in this particular case is what the output of top is when this is happening. Specifically, there's a couple lines at the top of top. So mem, which talks about your memory, and arc, which talks about the amount of memory ZFS is using. And those two will give us some information. In general, a 5400 RPM drive isn't going to be able to do that many IOPS, and doing a find is kind of an expensive operation for a drive like that. So you can expect some slowness, but it shouldn't be to the point where it's causing the system to hang momentarily and so on. So it probably shouldn't be as bad as you're seeing.
Sure.
Other things to look at, if you run gstat, it will give you stats from the geom layer, the lower layer disk level, and it'll show you the number of reads and writes that are happening and how long each one's taking on average. And also, you just zpool iostat will tell you, or zpool iostat 1 will print out every 1 second how much has been read and written from your pool, which will give you an idea of how much data is actually being moved around, and then comparing that to what you expect to get out of your drive, and you'll have a little better idea what's actually happening.
Okay. Well, cool. Yeah, if you want to send that info back in, we can help you take a look, or maybe you'll see something immediately when you take a look at that. But yeah, we would appreciate.
I wonder if
that.
he's
Maybe
actually
next
running
week
into
we
the
can
same
help you a
problem
little
that
more.
I am, where when doing a
yeah,
find
this
on a
one
big
currently.
directory, in my case, it's a directory full of SVN checkouts, where it's running up the other category of memory in the ARC, which isn't counted against the ARC max. And so even though I've told ZFS it can only have 6 gigs of memory, it's using that 6 gigs for the ARC cache, and then the other part is then taking up the rest of the RAM on my system.
Well, he said he sees this on 10.1
Right.
and 10.2 as well.
Yeah.
So I wonder. You said that was something.
Well, I don't know
right?
if it's that or if something else changed. I don't know. I gotta,
Just first time you noticed it. Or something?
only once I upgraded did I start having the problem where my file server would become unresponsive.
Sure.
But yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah. Send that info, and we'll see if we can help you figure it out, Don. Okay, and lastly, we have Fred, who asks about dual booting PCBSD with Linux. He said, hey guys, I've been trying to get a dual boot system going with a Linux partition and a PCBSD partition. None of the links I've Googled have worked for me. Background, I'd like to migrate to PCBSD from Linux. I feel like the old days when I booted into Linux for everything but games and booted into Windows XP to play games. Until BSD gets a native app for Steam, I think a dual boot would serve me well. He's not interested in wine, of course. All the operating systems should reside on the boot disk. He said the tutorial should start with disk partitioning with fdisk or gparted, followed by the sequence for installing Linux. He says he uses Mint and PCBSD, what version to use, any changes needed after the install. Having a second Linux partition for playing with other distributions would be nice. He said, I'm using ZFS under Linux now with RAID Z1 on separate disks, and it was very simple to recover from a disk failure. I don't know if that Linux partition should be ZFS or not. He's asking if we have any links that'll show him how to do this, and he said, oh, glad to be a guinea pig for testing. Please email me if you want more details about questions, etc. I don't know. I haven't done one in a long time. It's been a while since I've had to do a Linux dual boot. So typically, but what I would do, though, is boot up ahead of time with Linux or use gparted and partition a GPT disk. And then as long as I have the BIOS boot partition for Grub, for example, that they can share, I would install PCBSD second because PCBSD uses the newer version of Grub with some custom tweaks to to do boot environments, right? But that version of Grub's able to boot Linux as well. So as long as you can get PCBSD loaded on the disk, then you can just add your Linux menu entry to rgrub and you're good to go. It's like booting up on the Linux
and I
grub.
like his idea of having his other disks be ZFS and they can actually be shared between his Linux and BSD. For those, I would create them under Linux, just because Linux is usually further behind. So it means that it's the lowest common denominator. So let Linux create the pools, and it definitely won't use any features that BSD ZFS doesn't have. Whereas if you create it on too new of a FreeBSD or PCBSD, it will use features that Linux doesn't know about yet.
Yeah, that'll confuse it. So we maybe have to do a tutorial on that at some point. I don't know if we'll do it for the show here, but I might have one of the guys from PCBSD maybe write something up for our blog. I mean, maybe that would be helpful. I'll have them try we'll try Mint. Maybe we'll just do exactly what you're doing here, the Linux Mint with KDE, and just kind of do a walkthrough of this is how we dual booted, which I think that would be fun. So we'll see if we can get something working for you there. I don't know if in the handbook there's any information on that or not. Drew may have documented some of that, but I just know personally I haven't done one in years probably. so it's not too fresh in my memory. But yeah, we'll try and get back to you with something, Fred, that will allow you to do that. Okay, well, thanks for writing in, everybody.
Yes.
We appreciate that. So as we close the show, of course, we're going to remind you to keep sending all your stuff into feedback@bsdnow.tv. That's the only place we monitor. And, you guys have been doing really good sending us stuff in. We find stories that way, and, of course, we get all the feedback that way. But if you have somebody you'd like to interview or you're doing something interesting on a BSD and would like to come on and talk about it, we would be more than happy to have you. So please send something into feedback@bsdnow.tv, and we'll try and get you scheduled for an upcoming week. And we might have to talk to these retro guys at some point and find out what exactly are you doing with this. That would be an interesting interview for sure. But send everything into feedback@bsdnow.tv, and of course we will be back same time next week with another episode. So we will see you then.